Hi, glad to see you on my channel. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. Have a good view. Better late than never. The main reason why the American heavy self-propelled artillery was in such an unenviable position is to be found in the attitude of the Field Artillery Command. It seems that there were people there who knew nothing about the conclusions drawn from the study of World War I experience. Even then, much was already clear about the mobility of heavy artillery on the battlefields. The study of the experience showed that even the presence of mechanical traction does not allow to fully achieve high mobility on the battlefield. The conclusion was self-evident. Self-propelled artillery was required, which would not only be faster than the towed system, but would also be an order of magnitude faster to turn around at the position and just as quickly leave it. The correct conclusions were not realized at once for several reasons. A sharp decline in funding after the end of World War I, the fermentation of mines in the U.S. military command, and the lack of a suitable tank base. The work stopped for 20 years, and then there was a somewhat naive opinion that everything would be solved by high-speed artillery tractors. But the command of the American Field Artillery did not think that the towed artillery still has a lot of limiting parameters. This is the maximum speed of movement. For systems with metal wheels and rubber-wheeled running gear, it still did not exceed 30-35 km/h, and the time that was spent to turn the system into a combat position. This was fully true for the gun, which became the main American heavy artillery. It was the M1 100mm field meter gun, also known as the Long Tom. The development of this gun, which replaced the GPF 100mm field meter gun, lasted almost 2 decades, and it was adopted into service in 1938. As was often the case at the time, the system was duplex. A 203mm howitzer was also mounted on the same M1 carriage. In concept, the American duplex was closest to the Soviet BR-2, B-4. At the same time, unlike the BR-2, which was produced in an extremely modest volume, the American system turned out to be much more massive. From October 1940 to June 1945, 1882 guns were produced. The system had impressive data, and it had a successful carriage, which allowed to transport it relatively quickly. However, there are no miracles. The weight of the gun in the marching position was 13.8 tons, so there was no need to talk about high mobility. There was no question of a self-propelled artillery system using the 155mm M1 gun. The situation did not change after the GMC M12 was adopted in July 1942. It was armed with a 155mm gun, M1917, M1918, the same one that was replaced by the M1. It was quickly realized that the GMC M12 had much higher mobility than the towed guns, but the position of the U.S. Field Artillery Command was unchanged. They still believed that the Mac-No truck and later the M4 fast tractor would be sufficient for heavy artillery. Only by the beginning of 1944, when it became clear that the German Siegfried Line should be broken through with something powerful and mobile, the situation began to change. First, a program of modernization of GMC M12 and M30 ammunition carriers was launched. Secondly, on March 9, 1944, the Armament Committee recommended the development of a new SAU, this time using the M1A1 gun. The base was also changed. It became the medium tank M4. From the very beginning, the task was somewhat different from what was given during the development of the GMC T6. According to the requirements, it was supposed to be a fast combat vehicle for escorting units armed with tanks. That is, the concept was unambiguously repeated, the one that the Germans used when creating the Hummel SAU. But there were a lot of nuances. First of all, the mission initially assumed both mounted fire and direct fire. Secondly, this time the tank chassis could not be used in its pure form because the gun was larger, and even according to the initial data, the combat weight of the vehicle was 3,390 kilos, i.e., at the level of medium tank M4. And it was clearly not the limit because the width of the machine was supposed to be 3,150 millimeters. And in medium tank M4, this figure was 2,620 mm. So the chassis was built using medium tank M4 components, and the Continental R975 C4 radial engine as the most compact in terms of length. On March 23, 1944, the Armament Committee approved the start of work on this vehicle, giving it the designation 155mm gun motor carriage T-83. The development of this vehicle fell on the shoulders of the Tank Automotive Center in Detroit and the Press Steel Car Company, Pittsburgh, Illinois. This company also produced the GMC M12, so the choice of contractor seemed obvious. By that time, Press Steel had moved on to the production of medium tank M4A176, but in its pure form, its undercarriage was not suitable. It was obvious that the weight of the vehicle would increase, and everyone remembered the sad history of the medium tank T-23, which had too much specific pressure on the ground. Therefore, the undercarriage of the GMC T-83 was significantly changed from the very beginning. First of all, it was equipped with HVSS suspension, which proved to be obviously better than VVSS. Secondly, the chassis received all-metal T-66 tracks, which had a width of 500 mm. According to the order of the Armament Committee, Press Steel produced 5 pilot models of the vehicle. At the same time, 5 ammunition carriers were ordered, which similarly to the M12R-M30, were to be paired with self-propelled artillery units. The cargo carrier T-30 was similar to the GMC T-83 chassis, but instead of a gun, the ammunition compartment was equipped with 100 rounds of 155mm caliber ammunition. This time the ammunition carrier and the SAU, on the basis of which it was developed, appeared at the same time, by July 28, 1944. In reality, the combat weight turned out to be much higher than the initial one, amounting to 37 tons. It is not surprising, even taking into account the fact that the thickness of GMC T-83 armor was reduced to 12.7mm around the perimeter. The vehicle was 1,200mm longer, 530mm wider, and 105mm higher than the basic tank, not counting the gun. With it, the height of GMC T-83 was 3,300mm. At the same time, the specific pressure on the ground due to wide tracks was 0.75 kg/cm2, and the specific power, even in normal engine operation mode, was 10.8 HP per ton, quite normal figures. According to the original requirements, the ammunition should have been 25 rounds, but in practice they turned out to be 20. The overall layout of the GMC T-83 was similar to its predecessor. The gun was placed in the aft part of the hull, and it received a developed gun shield. The system with an additional floor above the coulter was retained, but the idea was significantly revised. Now the floor was sliding, and there was an additional section at the rear. In addition, the ammunition was placed in stacks behind the gun, so it was much more convenient to work with them. Also, the gun crew of 6 people, the total number of crew increased to 8 people, was much more comfortable. All numbers received folding seats. In short, a lot of work was done. As the tests showed, the GMC T-83 turned out to be an even more successful gun platform. The tests were conducted with both lowered and raised coulter. Similarly, the situation was simulated when it was necessary to urgently open fire almost on the move, for the assault of the Siegfried Line and similar tasks, an important function. In all these modes, the self-propelled artillery unit showed itself very well, and the mobility was quite good. For a short time, it was possible to accelerate up to 39 km/h, which is quite a decent result for such a machine. After the first stage of testing, during which the gun fired 200 rounds, it was decided to replace the gun with a 203mm howitzer M1. Such a replacement, given the unification, did not present any major problems. This change did not come from nothing. The fact is that in the spring of 1944, the Armament Committee initiated work on the HMC T-84, which was based on the medium tank T-26E1 chassis. But it quickly became clear that work on the HMC T-84 would be delayed, as the base tank was still being finalized. Therefore, the logical idea to do the same, but on the chassis of GMC T-83 was born. An additional plus was the fact that the stowage was universal, that is, remodeling was minimized. The GMC T-83, thus converted, underwent additional tests, during which it fired 75 rounds. The results of the tests showed that there were no problems with the conversion. For this reason, on November 2, 1944, the Armament Committee approved the howitzer variant as HMC T-89. The last 2 out of 5 pilot vehicles were produced in this configuration. They were produced in January 1945. Even before that, the second and third GMC T-89 pilots, which were produced in October 1944, were extensively tested at the Fort Bragg Proving Grounds. Based on the results of the tests, a list of changes was compiled that were required to be made to the production vehicles. One of the most important changes was to increase the internal volume of the fighting compartment, as well as to correct any deficiencies found. Nevertheless, it was clear the vehicle was a success. The launch of serial production was a decided issue, but with some nuances. First, standardization before the launch of serial production did not happen. Secondly, it was decided to abandon the ammunition carrier. Instead, this role was assigned to fast tractors M4 with trailers M23. Good, but a little late. After the Fort Bragg trials, the process of launching the GMC T-83 was a done deal. Another thing is that this process required time. So in January 1945, it was decided to send one sample each of the GMC T-83 and GMC T-89 to Europe. The choice fell on the third pilot model GMC T-83 and one of the two GMC T-89. The self-propelled howitzer had already been brought to the level of a production vehicle, i.e., all the comments from the tests were taken into account during its construction. Troop tests were conducted during the Zebra mission, the same mission during which the heavy tank T-26E3 was being tested. Thus, in February 1945, Pressed Steel had delivered the first production GMC T-83s to the front. The vehicles were sent to the 991st Artillery Division, which operated in conjunction with the 3rd Armored Division. The division was armed with GMC M12s, so the novelties came in very handy. However, almost at once, the self-rule began. The howitzer was removed from the HMC T-89 and replaced with a 155mm M1A1 gun, which was done to unify the systems. This very converted SAU was the first of those that brought their fire to Cologne on February 27, 1945. Then the division was repeatedly reassigned to infantry divisions, which it supported with fire. Later, however, the division again found itself in the same liaison with the 3rd Armored Division. During combat operations, the howitzer was returned to the HMC T-89, so it fought in its original configuration as well. The new SAU received high praise based on its combat performance, which also affected production plans. Although combat use was limited to the Zebra mission, it was enough to finally decide on standardization. In May 1945, the GMC T-83 was standardized as the GMC M40. By that time, Pressed Steel was producing these trucks, which, by the way, were gradually modified. To begin with, during the production, they began to put 150mm M2 guns, which received a new breech block. A more noticeable change was the replacement of the tracks. As practice showed, all metal T-66 tracks chewed the bands of the support rollers, which already had a number of problems. So in the future, they began to put rubber metal chevron tracks, T-80. They were received by later production vehicles. A total of 600 GMC M40s were ordered, on the background of 100 GMC M12s. This is a clear progress. After the HMC T-89 was tested at the front, its fate was decided. Pressed Steel received an order for 576 of these vehicles. Production began in June 1945, but standardization had to wait much longer. In the meantime, the end of the war had a direct impact on production plans. Overall, tanks and UAS, which were produced at that time, clouds have thickened. The U.S. budget was not a rubber band, so in the summer of 1945, the U.S. began to reduce production volumes. First of all, it concerned the UAS, which were in the lowest priority. Therefore, after the signing of the Surrender Act by Japan, which meant the end of World War II, the fate of the new UAS was predetermined. Production of the GMC M40 ceased in September 1945. By that time, 418 vehicles of this type were delivered. In the case of the HMC T-89, the situation was even sadder. Only 48 vehicles were delivered, In addition, 24 previously produced GMC M40s were converted into howitzer SAU. Only in November 1945, HMC T-89 were standardized. They became known as HMC M43. As in the case with the GMC M40, the late-type vehicles received T-80 tracks. A short trip to Europe turned out to be very extensive work on the finalization of the machine, which, however, were experimental in nature. The fact is that direct fire, which became quite a routine for GMC M12 and GMC M40, led to quite frequent clashes with German infantry. The armor protection of the vehicle could withstand rifle and machine gun fire, but there were losses from shell fragments coming from above and from the flanks. The GMC M10 and GMC M36 had similar problems, which were solved by the development of lightweight roofs for the combat compartment. The task for such development for the GMC M40 came personally from General Barnes, who headed the mission Zebra. The executors were employees of the Aberdeen Proving Ground, who promptly prepared a 1:8 scale model. Frankly speaking, the resulting structure resembled a barn. Of course, it covered the fighting compartment from above, from the front and from the side, but the size of the vehicle was much larger than without the roof. The second prototype GMC T-83, which by that time already had the designation M40, was used as a base for production. On the same vehicle was put a standard ball-mounted Browning M1919A4 course machine gun. The roof was made of shields, which had hinges. In case of need, it could be folded down. The range did not argue, but simply calculated what the weight of the roof would be, based on the materials as well as their thickness. It was supposed to be either aluminum alloy or steel. So even the lightest version of the roof had a mass of 1429 kilo and the heaviest 3.5 tons. Only after that, this idea was prudently abandoned. Another idea was to strengthen the defensive armament. The installation of a course machine gun alone was not enough. In June 1945, the GMC M40, whose armament would have been envied by the Gantrax, which later operated in Vietnam, came to the ranges. To judge for yourself, on the left and right were mounted one swivel with the same ball turrets as in the forehead of the hull, and rearward-looking swivels with standard Browning M1919A4 mounts. As an alternative, a 57mm T-15E13 recoilless gun was supposed to be mounted instead of the front machine guns. The third alternative was the installation of 75mm recoilless gun T-21. This armament provided almost all-round fire, but there were a lot of uncomfortable questions to those who ordered it. First of all, why was it necessary to make a self-propelled gun into a Gantrax? Moreover, the task of the vehicle was not to shoot enemy infantry at all. Secondly, the installation of recoilless guns itself was a bad idea. The powder gases that escaped during firing could easily kill someone from the crew. It should also be noted that the self-propelled duplex could become a triplex. On February 22, 1945, the Armament Committee approved the development of the mortar motor carriage T-94 self-propelled mortar. It was intended to be armed with a 254mm T5E2 breech-loading mortar. Later, a similar caliber T6E2 mortar was to be installed. Since the overall design of the carriage was similar to that of the Long Tom, installation of the mortar was not a problem. The combat weight of the MMC T-94 was estimated at 36,287 kilos, with the same ammunition as the GMC M40, 20 mines. In general, the design turned out to be quite successful. However, it did not go further than a full-size model of the mortar. On the right side of the deckhouse was mounted crane equipment, which was used to load mines. The crew was reduced to 6 people. On May 2, 1946, the vehicle was renamed to 250mm mortar carriage T-94, but it was rather a formality. In contrast to the GMC M12, which was quickly written off from the Army, its successor had a very different fate. Much more successful and mass-produced, this vehicle remained in service with the U.S. Army for a long time. In addition, it was modernized. In particular, some of the vehicles were equipped with rubber metal tracks, T-84. In this form, the vehicle fought in Korea. The M40, M43 were the most powerful self-propelled artillery units, which were used in that war. In the U.S. Army, GMC M40 and HMC M43 served until the second half of the 50s. The career of these vehicles abroad proved to be longer. In 1950, some number of this type of SAU entered service with the French Army as part of American military aid. In France, they remained in service until the end of the 60s. The second foreign operators of the GMC M40 were the British, who received more than 2.5 dozen of these vehicles. Sometimes there is information that these vehicles were designated as M40 Cardinal, but in fact, it is not so. The name Cardinal was carried by other SAU, HMC M44. As for the M40s, their designation remained the same. They were used in Bauer until at least the mid-60s. And from the point of view of survivability, the M40, M43 were much more lucky. In conclusion, it should be noted that the GMC M40 was an example of the correct approach to the issue of creating a heavy UAS. Instead of using an off-the-shelf chassis, which imposed a number of limitations, American designers made a chassis using units of the medium tank M4. This allowed to make a much better fighting vehicle than the M12. Another thing is that this all should have been done at least a year earlier. But this is a question to the American Field Artillery Command, which took so long. Thank you for watching the video to the end. Forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. It's important to me. See you soon.